Great to be here today. I want to thank Young America's Foundation and Laissez-Faire Books and each of the sponsors of Freedom Fest 2005 for putting on such a terrific conference for us all to enjoy this year. I get to talk to you all about Bill Clinton, specifically about Bill Clinton and his pattern of interactions with women over the years and what that might tell us about politics and liberalism. Now, we're all here at this convention trading ideas about these big important principles like free markets and individual liberty, democracy. What on earth, you might be wondering, would picking on Bill Clinton have to do with any of those grand ideas? I hope maybe by the end of this discussion that you will agree with me that it actually does bring some light on some of those bigger important issues, to take a look back at what Bill Clinton's history with women really has been, what his legacy with respect to women's rights will be, what it might mean for a Hillary Clinton presidency in the future, which could be around the corner, and what it means for each of us, even though we may have differing political views, to open ourselves up to thinking about an idea of feminism that maybe doesn't tally with the feminist groups that we hear from most loudly these days. The book I wrote, I called it Their Lives, the Women Targeted by the Clinton Machine, because with Bill Clinton's autobiography coming out last year, it was very easy to predict that he would leave a lot out, and he certainly did. He used up a lot of pages to talk about everyone in his life, from his school teachers to his mother, but he left out the lives and his impact on the lives of many women over the years that he's had interactions with. Some of them starting back when he was Attorney General of Arkansas, spreading all the way out through his presidency. And the idea that through all of this, and I'll take you through briefly some of their stories of what it was like to have these interactions with Bill Clinton and the fallout that they received. Through all of that, Bill Clinton still managed to win the women's vote twice in presidential elections. He still managed to have the support of feminist groups during both of his elections. And even today, there's really very little talk about how a president so upheld in the media and by the left-wing feminists for being pro-women could have treated women so badly in his personal life. I want to start by focusing on two different groups of women who have come forward over the years talking about their experiences with Bill Clinton. One of those groups are women who talk about having had consensual affairs with Bill Clinton at various points in his life, and the real mistreatment that they suffered wasn't in their encounter with him physically. It was after they became political liabilities, after they felt the need or were pressured to come forward publicly or testify in some proceeding against him, and what kind of treatment they suffered once they became that kind of a liability to him. The other group of women is, if anything, more serious and deserves more perspective, and that is women who have come forward and talked about actual physical encounters with Bill Clinton that were not voluntary, were not consensual, that really these stories, I don't think you can look back at what these women are saying and not think of Bill Clinton as having committed sexual harassment, sexual abuse, and that's very serious misbehavior that I think deserves attention as his legacy starts going down in the history books. In the first group of women, stretching all the way back to the early 1980s and even the 1970s, we have names that may or may not sound familiar now. Women like Elizabeth Ward Grayson. She was a former Miss America and had a one-time fling with Bill Clinton in 1983. She kept quiet about it for a while at her own choosing, but then when Bill Clinton decided to run for president in 1992, it wasn't at her own choosing that she kept quiet at that point. She was specifically asked by the Clinton campaign to lie publicly about the affair that they had, and she went along with it. She issued a public statement denying that anything had ever happened between them, went on trying to build her own acting career, had a little help from Clinton and his Hollywood pals in her acting career as a little bit of a reward for playing along, and tried to go about her business. Now, when a friend of hers testified in the Paula Jones lawsuit about Elizabeth Ward Grayson, then she was faced with being subpoenaed to testify in that lawsuit. Well, under threat of a subpoena, now that that was floating out there, Bill Clinton and his team started piling on the pressure. There were anonymous phone calls. You better not be around. You better not talk publicly about whatever happened between you and the president. And so she ran for it. Here's a former Miss America escaping her own country just to avoid the frightening possibility of having to choose between testifying against Bill Clinton or facing contempt of court or facing whatever kind of retribution Clinton's team had already been threatening her with. So for a few years there, in the mid-1990s, she was on the run. Her apartment was broken into. She suffered through an IRS audit for no apparent reason. She was hassled and intimidated and harassed to the point that when she finally relented and came back into the country after it became clear that the Paula Jones lawsuit would no longer force her to testify, she ended up saying publicly what a nightmare the entire situation had been, how frightened she had been for her life. Her family members had been threatened. And all of this to apparently avoid an admission on Clinton's part that, okay, yeah, I had an extramarital affair. I don't know that any of us really believe that if Clinton had admitted to an affair like that, that he would have been knocked out of the presidential race or lost re-election. I think probably not. I think most Americans have a decent understanding of allowing somebody to deal with their private life privately. What transforms Bill Clinton's misbehavior from merely being within his private life to reflecting on his, what he calls, presidential character in his memoirs, is the fact that he's willing to go to any length to detract, deter, and intimidate anyone, even these women, who all they're doing is telling their story. All they're doing is telling their truth. Similarly, a woman named Sally Perdue, name might strike a bell, goes way back, in the 1992 campaign came forward on the Sally Jesse Raphael show. Maybe not the best place for her to come out in, but that's the venue that would interview her. So she told America about having had a brief affair with Bill Clinton. And right away, the Clinton campaign, this was in 1992, a few months before the election, they hired private investigators with campaign funds to track these women down, to talk to their family and friends, to dig up any possible dirt on women like Sally Perdue as possible, and again, to harass them and intimidate them into keeping quiet. Now, the American media played along with that strategy very effectively. Up through the mid-1990s, the American press really wasn't willing to investigate or give much credibility to any of these women who came forward. And so women like Sally Perdue, their stories were heard in the foreign press. She had interviews in London newspapers and Australian newspapers, but not in American newspapers. And her whole point in coming forward, she said, was, you know what? I don't mean to try to derail his career. I just thought the American people might want to know a little bit of personal history about this man before they elect him president. But the media didn't play along with that, and her voice was silenced pretty quickly. She went back underground and wasn't heard from again for a long time. Now, several years later, the American press finally picked up on her story, and when that happened, she began also receiving threatening calls. She was being followed, she was being harassed, and so she decided to try to put herself out there in the public eye in order to maybe feel a little safer. And once again, she is one of those women who had to pay a price just for coming forward and trying to tell her version, her story about an interaction with a very powerful man. The 1992 election, no discussion of it, I don't think, would be quite complete without talking about Gennifer Flowers. Jennifer with a G, mind you. It was a display of almost soap opera drama there for a while in early 1992. Jennifer Flowers, I think contrary to popular belief, didn't come forward with her story voluntarily. It was actually a disgruntled state employee that Clinton had fired while he was governor of Arkansas, who alleged that Jennifer Flowers had had an affair with Bill Clinton, and that became public. Once that happened and her name was being thrown around, yeah, she came forward and held her own press conference and gave her own interviews about what happened between her and Bill Clinton. Unlike some of these other women, she didn't talk about just having a one-night stand or a brief fling with him. She talked about being in love with this guy for 12 years. It was pretty dramatic, and she talked about a very intimate relationship that they had shared on and off for 12 years. As soon as she came out and said that truth, the Clinton team let loose on her. She was trash. She was just out for cash. She was a dollar chaser. You can't trust anything this woman says. You know, the Clintons, Bill and Hillary, eventually actually appeared together on 60 Minutes to try to put the story to rest. And they talked about overcoming marital problems, and you know, Bill said once again, this was just a friend, this was nobody special. And she didn't stand for it. She continued to publicize her story. Now, you know, maybe if it had been one of us, we would have chosen a different way to get the truth out there. And certainly she did set herself up for appearing to make as much money and notoriety off of her story as possible. But with Jennifer Flowers, one of the critical things to remember looking back is that Bill Clinton himself eventually vindicated her. From his own mouth, in a sworn deposition, 6 years later, after the story first broke and he denied it and smeared her, he admitted that she'd been telling the truth, that they had had an affair. Now, you know, to me, that just shows a pattern on his part of, you know, it's going to be difficult to tell where the truth lies if somebody can deny it for so long, finally admit that it's the truth, and then say nothing more about it. Of course, Monica Lewinsky is probably the most memorable example of one of Bill Clinton's consensual affairs. And her story, of course, occurred while he was president, which made it the biggest scandal of all, I suppose. And I think it's important when we look at the Monica Lewinsky story and all of these women to separate out the reaction politically that took place at the time. I think a lot of Americans ended up thinking worse of Ken Starr, for example, and thinking worse of the House Republicans for trying to impeach Clinton over all this than they did of Bill Clinton's actual behavior. But now that he's out of office, there's no more question about whether he should have ever been elected or whether he should have been impeached for any of this. The only question now is, what does his behavior tell us now? What can we learn from his behavior about women's rights in this country, about feminism, and about his own liberal ideology? Is there a connection? But with Monica Lewinsky, of course, there was an affair that went on over the course of about a year and a half. And when it eventually blew up into a public scandal, Bill Clinton completely turned his back on her. This was a very young woman at the time, and she ended up feeling taken advantage of and betrayed and put through a nightmare of a legal mess, with no offer by Bill Clinton to make any of that easier on her, even though he was, you know, I would say 50% or more of the problem that caused her situation in the first place. These women who talk about having had extramarital affairs with Bill Clinton, once again, the aspect of his treatment of them that converts this from just, well, you know, here's a philanderer, here's a guy who cheats on his wife, you know, politically, why should we care? Is what he did with his power structure behind him to silence and discredit these women. That's the key factor for me in all of these kinds of attacks, whether it was hiring private investigators to follow them, having the IRS audit them, having thugs confront these women and threaten them to keep quiet, anonymous phone calls telling them to stay away from testifying. All of these things, they show a pattern of a belief on Bill Clinton's part that his life and his ambitions are 1,000 times more important than hers. And you can see that with each one of these women. And that's the core of the mistreatment issue, and what I would even call, after looking at the pattern of this, the misogyny issue on Bill Clinton's part, is that he has no qualms about using these women when they suit his needs, but then he throws them away, and he does more than that. He comes out and humiliates them and terrifies them and wants to make sure that even though he participated in the behavior that they're talking about, he participated in these affairs, he doesn't want to let them get away with ever telling the truth about it. So it shows a real lack of regard for these women's self-esteem, shows a lack of regard for their financial and emotional well-being. It shows a utter disrespect for them as real people. He allowed his team to go out there and publicly discredit and smear these women, painting them into a box of just dollar chasers and sluts and gold diggers, and really didn't give them the credibility, the dignity of being actual human beings. Which is, in my mind, one of the fundamental things about being a supporter of women's rights, is that you're willing to treat women with respect and give them the autonomy that they're entitled to as a human being. Now, of course, the second group of women who have come forward to talk about Bill Clinton are, in my mind, even more dramatic portrayal of this pattern of misogyny on Bill Clinton's part. And these are women like Paula Jones and Kathleen Willey and Juanita Broderick, each of whom came forward with stories of, to one degree or another, real sexual assault, harassment, and in the case of Juanita Broderick, even rape. And when I started research for this book, most of my awareness of what had happened between Bill Clinton and these women had come through the media. And so I had kind of walked away with a picture of, okay, how credible can these claims really be? So, he's a wanderer and kind of a low guy, but, would he really stoop that low? I spent a lot of time with these women and with their varying accounts over time, with previously published reports of these, with details that had been investigated. I came away thinking that each of these women was extremely credible. And that should be disturbing. It should be very disturbing that a woman can credibly cry rape against someone that we elected President of the United States, and really there are no repercussions. There can't be any legal repercussions because too much time had gone by for her to actually hold him accountable criminally or civilly. But there should be public repercussions. This should be something that we talk about. This should be something that we make an example of, so that kind of behavior can lessen in our society. The very last thing that kind of credible accusation should lead to is Bill Clinton going down in history as some great hero for women. I think that kind of conduct just betrays that kind of legacy that he would like to leave us with. Briefly, Paula Jones, alone in a hotel room with him as a lowly state worker for 15 minutes, and Bill Clinton came onto her very strongly, and not just with words, but also with actions. And she extricated herself from the situation eventually, but not before he had made a very gross display and request for sexual favors. She was humiliated, she was mortified, and she was a little bit scared. I mean, this was the governor of Arkansas at the time. She was a lowly state worker. What was she supposed to think? It had been state troopers who had brought her up to see Bill Clinton in the first place. There was nobody for her to complain to or talk to about this. She told some friends, and she told her boyfriend, and she told her family what had happened, and she let it go. And that was back in 1991. By 1994, some of Bill Clinton's former bodyguards, some of his state troopers, had come forward with full disclosure about everything they had ever seen the guy do. We arranged liaisons for him. We drove women to his place. We did all this for him. And in an article detailing these law enforcement officers' disclosures, the article mentioned that a woman named Paula, on that date at that hotel, had gone up to Clinton's room and had come out saying, "I'm ready to be his girlfriend." Well, Paula Jones read that, and that was the furthest thing that had happened The truth was so far from that. She had been mortified by what had occurred, and now here was this other version of that story in a national magazine, and all she wanted was to clear her name. Now that simple desire on her part, just to clear her name and get an apology, is not so easy to do when you're going up against the President of the United States. She hired a lawyer, and as we all know, it led to an excruciating 5.5-year court battle, went all the way up to the Supreme Court with a decision that now binds future presidencies, millions of dollars in legal fees, the end of a marriage for Paula Jones. The entire event was a disaster for her life, but I can't blame her for what she originally wanted, which was to make sure that everyone understood that she hadn't done anything untoward, that her reputation was intact. I think in that desire she eventually succeeded, though at a very high cost, because when she first came forward with her lawsuit, and she sued him for sexual harassment, which ended up being very difficult to prove because you have to legally show an impact on your employment, and that would have been a pretty tough connection for her to make legally. But as far as what actually happened to her in that hotel room, it was harassment, even if it didn't meet the legal definition. It was an objectification of her and an unwanted sexual advance that made her feel humiliated and uncomfortable and used. And that, I think absolutely she had a right to call attention to it and try to get us to pay attention to what kind of a person we're sending into office. As soon as she came forward with her lawsuit, the Clinton team unleashed its spin doctors on her. She became just another piece of white trash, just another eruption of Mount Bimbo. James Carville, advisor to the president, unleashed his most famous attack when he said, "Drag $100 through a trailer park, there's no telling what you'll find." She was mocked for how she looked. She was mocked for, in the words of Andy Rooney, ever having the gall to believe that the president or any man would be attracted to her. It was a vicious public attack. And, you know, when push came to shove, nobody's ever going to be able to prove in a court of law whether what she says happened really did. But some very, very thoughtful treatments of all of the evidence involved in the case led to the conclusion that her allegations were at least as credible as Anita Hill's against Clarence Thomas, and probably more so. And her allegations not only were credible, but they were more serious, because this was an encounter that involved not just some off-color jokes or some untoward hints. This was an actual physical attempt on Clinton's part up in that hotel room to do something with her. So Paula Jones's lawsuit spawned really the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Her lawsuit trying to get the depositions of any other women out there who had ever had similar experiences with Bill Clinton is what ended up forcing so many other women to testify. That's why we now know about Kathleen Willey, who had an encounter with Bill Clinton in the Oval Office in 1993. Kathleen Willey was a stay-at-home mom, a soccer mom at that time, volunteering in the White House. Her husband was an attorney with a lot of good Democratic connections. And unfortunately, he had gotten himself in a lot of financial trouble, embezzling from clients, and their finances were just in ruin. So Kathleen Willey went to Bill Clinton, who she was on a first-name basis with. He was friendly towards the Willeys, and asked him for a job. Said, "Here's what's going on in my life. My husband's finances are ruined. I need a job." Well, he listened to her and he sympathized with her, and then he pulled her aside and just threw himself at her, touching her and kissing her and groping her, and it was almost bizarre to hear from her how and why something like that would have happened at a time like that. But once again, Kathleen Willey strikes me as a very strong and dignified person, and when I took a look back at her story, I couldn't help but find it extremely credible. She told a few friends about it right away, but really pushed it out of her mind for a little while, because as it turned out, as she ran from the Oval Office, very distraught after that happening to her, unbeknownst to her until the following morning, her husband had been so devastated by what he had done, he had gone out and committed suicide that day. So there she was, a grieving widow, trying to take care of her children, trying to put her financial life back on track, and now dealing with the fact that the President of the United States just took advantage of her that way, and she's depending on him to get her a job. It led to just years of torment for her. She kept quiet about it, though. She never said a word, not for years, and she never intended to. She tells me she never ever wanted that to go public. She stayed on friendly terms with Bill Clinton. He got her a job at the White House for a while, like she wanted. And only when her name came up in the Paula Jones lawsuit and she was forced to testify, did the real problem start for her. She fought the subpoena for a while. She didn't want to testify. And while she was fighting the subpoena, the Clinton team publicly said, "Oh, well, you know, we're not going to comment on it. We're not going to comment on what her story might be. We're just going to try to leave her, you know, to her privacy and hope that she doesn't have to testify." Well, in the background, Clinton's lawyers were meeting with Kathleen Willey and, you know, in not a very subtle way, threatening her. Now, if anything did happen, it wasn't sexual harassment, right? I mean, it wasn't unwanted. Well, yes, it was, she said, and you know, they just shake their heads and leave her feeling very vulnerable. And sure enough, 2 days before her deposition, she was approached while she was jogging by a thug, never found out who he was, and he knew that her car tires had been slashed recently. He knew that her cat had disappeared recently. He knew the names of her children. He knew the names of her lawyers, and he spat all this out at her and then said, "You're just not getting the message, are you? Don't go in there and testify." She knew was the message. She testified anyway, and when you read her, if you read her deposition transcript, you got to feel some sympathy for her. She's working so hard to say just enough that she's not committing perjury, but not enough to get her in trouble with the Clinton crew. So she's very, very tight-lipped when she's testifying. But eventually the public pressure and the retaliation by the Clinton campaign, who immediately started going out there and spreading stories about her, about how you know, she was deranged, she was emotionally unstable, you can't believe anything this woman says. Never mind that Clinton had just appointed her to a volunteer position with the U.S. military the previous year, but she's so unbalanced, she's so deranged, you can't believe anything she says. She must have just been devastated by her husband's death, and so for whatever reason, she's just making this up against Bill Clinton now. Well, after going through that kind of a public smear attack and being followed by these private investigators and having all of these intimidating incidents happen with her cat and her car, she eventually did tell her full story, and she told it publicly on 60 Minutes. And after that, it was many, many more months for her of enduring threatening phone calls and being followed in her small hometown to try to get her to stay quiet about it. The media reaction by the time Kathleen Willey's story broke, which was at about the same time as the Monica Lewinsky scandal, the media had finally started to catch on that there was maybe not enough good reason to believe every one of Clinton's denials. And so I think the media actually did a decent job uncovering the Monica Lewinsky story and the Kathleen Willey story. It was late in coming, and it wasn't complete, but there was a little bit more recognition in the press that you couldn't swallow every one of the Clinton White House's denials anymore. When all was said and done, of course, it eventually led to impeachment proceedings. The Senate acquitted President Clinton for, charges like obstruction of justice and perjury, and these women were left to pick up the pieces of their lives, and we never really heard about them or from them again. Some of them found little ways here and there to keep their names and faces in the media, but overall, that was it. Clinton gets to go on with his life and build his legacy as a two-time president, and these women are left to face the public fallout, the scorn of being written off as just pieces of white trash. Many of them had a lot of difficulty for years finding jobs. Nobody would hire them once it was found out that they were connected to a Clinton scandal. And many of them didn't feel safe for quite a while. Their lives overall have calmed down now, and it's wonderful to see how some people, especially women like Juanita Broaddrick, who have gone on to build very meaningful lives for themselves. But it's not it's to their credit that they have been able to move on. But it doesn't mean that we don't need to take a look back and put into perspective what happened to them and what it might tell us about not only Bill Clinton as a person, but also about his politics. And the paradox that really drove me to write a book like this was, how in the world can you be politically supportive of so-called women's rights but personally be so abusive towards women? And the ultimate act of abuse, of course, was Juanita Broaddrick and what she suffered in the 1970s. She was volunteering for Bill Clinton's campaign while he was running for governor. And they met up just to talk about the campaign, and he very violently raped her. And it's not a story that she told willingly. It's not an experience that she likes talking about at all. And it took her a couple of decades to talk about it publicly. But she eventually did tell her story and leave us with an impression that, to me, was this very credible story of a very violent assault committed against a woman by Bill Clinton. The media, of all of the stories, the media probably paid the least attention to Juanita Broaddrick's. And I don't know if that's because by the time she finally came forward, the impeachment proceedings were over, and there was no more, there's kind of nowhere for the story to go, and the media was kind of left saying, what do we do with this? We can't disprove her story. We've tried. We looked into it. We investigated her. We can't find any reason to disbelieve her, but we don't know what to do about it either because he's almost out of office. What are we going to do? Well, I think the only answer to that is to have a discussion about the dangers of allowing that kind of behavior to just kind of squeeze by us silently without comment. That's probably the most brutal way a person can violate a woman, and it was committed by a person who's been held up as a supporter of women. And that kind of paradox, I think, needs to be blown apart. That's kind of the quick version of what Bill Clinton did with respect to women in his so-called personal life. And the question I get most often is, so what? What's the point? Why do we care what he did in his personal life like that? And there are a couple of reasons that I think it's important and has implications for the political scene. One is that Bill Clinton, of course, wasn't the only Clinton involved in all this. Hillary Clinton was right there at his side, right there to be the first one to jump in and lead the smear teams and hire the investigators and make sure that these women were discredited publicly. And that kind of behavior, that kind of willingness to mistreat women, coming from a woman like Hillary Clinton, is a little bit startling. And with her poised to probably run in 2008, I think it's a valid issue to raise. How supportive is she truly of women's rights? When she was willing to stand by her man and take an active role, actually, in allowing this kind of mistreatment to be perpetrated. And the political point of all of this is, I came to realize through looking at all this that it's more than just simple hypocrisy that went on here. It's more than just a coincidence that this terrible pattern of misogyny was committed by a politician who politically gets away with being called a women's rights guy. It actually, I think there's actually a connection between Bill Clinton's liberal politics and his mistreatment of women. Now, there are a lot of other factors that go into why a person would mistreat women that way. Psychological factors, emotional factors. You got to be predisposed to undervalue or disrespect women. Not all liberals are misogynists. Let me just make that clear. But at the same time, I think that the liberal ideology that Bill Clinton really adheres to and the liberal values that he tries to promote and the methods he uses to promote those actually helped contribute to his special brand of misogyny. For me, it comes down to the central method of liberalism, that you have these values. Let's say one of them is gender equality, which it is. Liberals are out there saying women are equal. We need to, give women special rights, and we need to look out for women. If you looked at the campaign web pages for John Kerry and George Bush last election, John Kerry had a special tab on his web page, what I'll do for women. George Bush didn't have a tab like that, and that it's just an example of how these days only liberals are feminists, only liberals care about women's rights, and if you don't hop on board with the feminist platform, you're written off as a misogynist. Feminist groups despise George W. Bush, and I would actually submit that he is much more a true feminist than Bill Clinton ever could be. So liberalism holds up certain values like gender equality, like peace, like racial equality, like helping the poor. And they may or may not be excellent values for us to hold personally. But the problem, I think, is that liberalism advocates using political force to enforce all those values. So all of a sudden, it's not enough that women are no longer prevented from working or going to college. We have to have special outreaches for women. And we have to buy into the program that you can't be pro-life and be pro-woman, which is simply not true. There are 100 good reasons to be pro-life, none of which reflect on whether you're pro or anti-woman. And yet the left-wing liberals have gotten away with making it sound like if you're pro-life, you must hate women. And it's taking a look at some of the values of liberalism and some of the methods that are used to implement those values that I see the connections between liberalism itself and the kind of misogyny that Bill Clinton practiced. For example, in the case of Gennifer Flowers, one of the ways that Bill Clinton's machine was able to write her off as somebody not to be believed was he was very effective at convincing us all to judge the message by the messenger. She's out for money, she's making money off of telling her story, she's out to embarrass me. Those are bad motives, so nothing she says can be true. And it worked for the most part. That kind of effort worked. Of course, the truth, especially in Gennifer Flowers' case, ended up being that despite her motives, even if her motives were bad, what she was saying was the truth, and Bill Clinton eventually admitted it. And liberalism uses that method quite a bit, I've noticed, to further political debate. For example, Hillary Clinton's motives are excellent and pure. She wants to provide health care for all of us, if you remember back in the early 1990s. Well, her motives are good, so anything she proposes is a good plan. And of course, if you oppose government control of health care the way Hillary wants to do it, you must have bad motives, and you must, want for millions and millions of children to be sick. It works the other way too. If you're George Bush and you have been unwilling to sign the UN Treaty on Women's Rights, then you must hate women. You must have a horrible motive, and so no reason that you put forward for maybe wanting to take a pause before we turn over a lot of U.S. sovereignty to a foreign treaty like that. None of those reasons are valid because we've already assumed to know your bad motives, so nothing you say can be valid after that. Another method that liberalism relies on heavily to promote its own values and principles is the idea that group rights are a lot more important than individual rights. And that ties in particularly clearly to the stories of some of these women. Let's take Paula Jones, for example. If you look at her as just a member of the group called Women, then Bill Clinton thinks he took a pretty good took care of her pretty well. He did a pretty good job for her because he was promoting women's issues. But when you look at how he treated her as an individual person, it all falls apart. And liberalism tends to put so much emphasis on doing things for groups, and we need to help women do this, and we need to help poor working mothers do that, and we need to we need to help minority groups in this way. Well, you lose a lot of focus on individual rights if you're constantly focused on the rights of certain groups. And I think that has a direct parallel to if you're going to follow that motto in your politics, it makes it easier to follow that motto in your personal life and say, well, I'm doing good for a lot of people over here, so it doesn't matter if I trample on one person over there. The last one I tie into Juanita Broaddrick's story, and I'll end on this, is liberalism at the core, unlike conservatism or libertarianism, has no problem whatsoever using political force to achieve each and every one of its goals. That to me is the key. That to me is what it really boils down to. It's not to say that what liberals hold as valuable is a bad thing. Protect the environment, equality for women. Those are good things. But to enforce all those things through the political process, which always comes down to using force, laws, and regulations to make those things happen, I think is a very, very dangerous aspect of liberalism, and it's where, we conservatives and libertarians, I think, have a lot to tell America about the value of freedom of interaction, true freedom of choice, which means set up some ground rules, government, set up some ground rules, but then let us interact the way that we'd like to with each other. And by doing that, we leave each of us free to go out there through our communities, through our churches, and through the different organizations we belong to, and promote whatever values we want. As a libertarian feminist, I focus on keeping government to a minimum precisely so that I can go out there and try to talk to people about the importance of things like genuine feminism, of things like treating women with respect and protecting women and fighting against assault against women and those kinds of things. But I'm not concerned with getting government, like the liberals are, to step in and do it for me. It's harder work when we have to talk to each other, when we have to convince each other that this is the right thing to do, that it's a good thing to do. It's a lot easier of a shortcut when we can go convince a few politicians to pass a law about it, to pass a regulation about it. So we get to impose our values without really ever having to convince each other that those are the right values. And in a case like Juanita Broaddrick, the parallel that I see is that if your politics say it's okay to use force to achieve your goals, then it's really only a fine line to saying, here's what I want, I'm going to take it by force, even on a personal or sexual level. And that's some of the danger that I see and why Bill Clinton's pattern of misogyny and mistreatment of women really isn't just about his personal behavior, and it's not something we should just say, well, that's in the past and move on. We should talk about it, and we should let it lead to a discussion of the difference between liberal philosophy and conservative or libertarian philosophy, the difference between what government should step in and force us to do and what we should be allowed to do for ourselves and through voluntary interactions with each other. That's kind of a wrap-up for me of what I was going to talk with you about, and if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to talk with you more. Yes?
Thank you for your very broad explanation of these things. I have
Could you step up to the microphone so we can all? Thank you.
It seems to me that with all due respect, you don't give enough credit to the intelligence of American public, because all of these stories that you very eloquently expressed have been in the media over and over and over again. I am a newsaholic, and I tune in almost 10 hours a day, and I have listened to all of these stories many, many times. So American public heard it, and they made the decision, and they decided not to convict President Clinton.
Yeah,
Mrs. Broadwick, if Mrs. Broadwick had been raped, she had every right to press charges against Bill Clinton. Miss Kathleen Wiley, as soon as the story came, then another story came that she had been, after she makes the allegation of these advances of Bill Clinton, then there was the story that she had written a letter to President thanking him and also asking for a job at a higher position, like
Right.
you know.
I appreciate this comment.
And you know, so what I'm saying is that I really have more confidence in the ability of these women. You look at these women as helpless pawn in the hands of a very strong man. I think American women are very, very strong, are very independent, and I think all of these women, they actually, they could make a decision for themselves, and all of them, and you said the story, you only said half of the story. You only said half of the story in every case to fit the hypothesis that you had, because in most of these cases, the money, thousands of dollars, was raised by different groups who were opposing Bill Clinton.
Sure,
and
that's very true.
And I understand that, and there's no problem, no question.
Let me address
I just want to say that in every single one of these cases, money was raised, and these women have benefited from all of these. And women in this country are smart enough to understand. So don't underestimate them. If women still support Bill Clinton, it's not because they are not smart enough.
No,
they understand. They understand what went on. And I'm not justifying what Bill Clinton. Right. Everybody knows Bill Clinton was a womanizer.
Let me respond to that. We only have a few more minutes, so I want to get to another question too. Most of the response is in the book, so pick up a copy of Their Lives, because that would require a very detailed response. She raises many common points and many valid points. I would just respond briefly that overall, none of this is meant to imply that women aren't strong or independent, or even that the American public wasn't informed to some degree and still made the choice to elect Bill Clinton twice and not impeach him. That's very true. And I'm not necessarily saying that we should have made a different choice. I am saying that now that he's out of office and he's choosing to shape his legacy, that women's rights and women's issues are made up a big part of his political life, and that we do have a responsibility to take into account a more detailed look at what these women went through. And I actually encourage everybody, read Bill Clinton's autobiography, My Life. It's the only fair thing to do. That's his words, that's his story, that's how he's choosing to tell you about his life. It's the only fair thing to do. Read his, read mine, decide who you believe for yourself, and there's no political ramification for it at this point except to hold a personal judgment about what you think of this president and of this man, and to take it into account if it has any philosophical implications for what kinds of decisions we make about our leaders in the future. Any other back there?
Tell us about one other woman who was abused by Clinton, namely Dolly Kyle Browning.
Yeah, Dolly Kyle Browning, I didn't feature her in my book, but there's no particular reason except that for brevity I had to choose a representative sample of women to go into detail about. But Dolly Kyle Browning had a ongoing, very intimate relationship with Bill Clinton spanning 30 years. They were very close friends, dating all the way back to when they were in high school together. And when she came out, she actually told her story through fiction initially, and wrote about her experiences and her relationship with Bill Clinton through fiction. And like so many of the women that we've talked about already, was very quickly marginalized. I actually make one note in the book that she, more than any of the others perhaps, had reason to feel especially betrayed by Bill Clinton, because it sounded like she had a very close personal friendship with him, as well as a sexual relationship for many, many years, and it hurt when his machine came out and wrote her off like it did all of the others, that she was nobody to be believed. I think that ended up hurting her very badly. Any other questions before we wrap up? If not, thank you so much for letting me talk to you today.